Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the Synthetic Data Summit. My name is Khalid Al-Imam. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Replica Analytics. I'm also a professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health. So first of all, I want to thank you for joining us and mention that this summit is a partnership between Replica Analytics and Health City in Edmonton. Plus, we have a few other organizations that have helped us organize this Connection Silicon Valley and US network. So I'd like to thank them as well for getting us here today. I'm just going to say a few things to get us started and kind of set the scene for this event. And then we'll get going with the presentations in our schedule. So first of all, at Replica Analytics, we've been in the synthetic data generation business for over 2 years now. Our primary focus has been on health data. We've been working with Health City and our other partners in Alberta to advance and apply synthetic data generation technology to complex longitudinal EHR, electronic health record data sets. And you'll hear more about that today. With our Alberta partners, we've been driving a strong innovation agenda on this topic to enable responsible secondary uses of health data, very rich health data that the province has. And this is part of that effort. Much has been learned about the technology, methodology for synthetic data generation, market readiness for this approach, about the immediate use cases where synthetic data solves a big problem, the adoption challenges, and the path forward. The path forward to make synthetic data generation part of the future of data sharing and health data simulation. So we decided to organize this event to share some of these experiences and learnings with the broader community. We're hoping to make this an annual event, but let's see how this first one goes. Presenting to us today are various organizations that have a strong interest and usage of synthetic data generation. They will each explain why and how, why they've used synthetic data and how they've used it. We have a mix of perspectives from academia, life sciences industry, and research funders. And it'll be a little bit of looking back what we have learned and also looking forward in terms of the vision and the potential for synthetic data generation. And you may have noticed over the last few months, synthetic data has shown up in the media, the trade media, the technical media, and just the general media, business media as well. So there's certainly increasing interest in this topic over the last little while, and I suspect that will continue moving forward. Just a little bit about the logistics. The whole session will last for 2 hours, and it'll be recorded. Please use the chat function in Zoom to post your questions, or use the Q&A box as well. We'll be monitoring both of those to make sure that we get to all of your questions. We'll also be sending you the materials from this summit in the next couple of days. So you will be hearing from me again by the end of the week. And we'll also be sending you a post-event survey right away to get your feedback. And of course, we'd appreciate your candid comments about what worked and what did not work. So again, you'll be hearing from me right away after this, and then later in the week with a link to all the materials from this session. So I think we have, the numbers have stabilized in terms of folks joining. So let me introduce our first two presenters. And with that, I'll stop sharing. And if Lucy and Dean can put their videos on and share their screen with their presentation slides, that'd be great. So the two presenters are Lucy Mosquera, who is the Director of Data Science at Replica Analytics. And Lucy has been part of Replica Analytics from the very beginning and has been instrumental in developing the data synthesis technology that the company has been using. Dr. Dean Urick is a professor and program director for the clinical epidemiology program within the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. And his current research focuses on the use of large health databases to evaluate real-world interventions and policies on health outcomes in patients with chronic disease with a particular focus on First Nations people. And with that, I will let Lucy and Dean take over. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think I'm up first to help present this. So I just want to echo Khaled's comments. It's very exciting to be here. We are seeing synthetic data in the news and research papers a lot more. And for me to be involved in the project was a real learning experience for me. And I'll hope to display some of that learnings to you today. Next slide, Lucy. So as Khaled talked about, we were going to walk through the Alberta Synthetic Data Research Project today. You know, what is synthetic data? What are some of the use cases around it? And then we want to spend the bulk of our time actually talking about the data that we used here in Alberta, the complexity of it, how we synthesized the data, and how we validated that data. And then at the end, we want to finish off with some of the privacy aspects around synthetic data and what some of the advantages of synthetic data might be. Next slide. So as Khaled mentioned, Alberta has some of the best databases in North America, particularly around administrative health databases because of our universal healthcare system. And so there's a lot of interest in using Alberta data for all kinds of projects, both research and non-research. One of the difficulties, though, is sharing that data across research communities, but also within academic institutions. And when you're talking health data, it's particularly difficult to share that information and data with outside companies and outside organizations who are not part of the research community. And so synthetic data has a potential to maybe overcome this limitation and allow for greater sharing and utilization of this data, again, to help answer some of the questions that not only researchers have, but many other organizations would have with the Alberta data. So with that in mind, we wanted to develop and try to look at synthetic data to understand what are the biggest opportunities and limitations of synthetic data. We wanted to explore how to best generate synthetic data with very complex data sets, particularly the Alberta health data sets, identify any key privacy concerns so that we can, once we generate this data, we can actually share it with these organizations and meet that goal of making data more liberal in Alberta. And then we wanted to make sure that any data that we did generate obviously was validated against the real data to ensure that it is representative of what is happening within the province. Next slide. So in terms of our project partners and structure, Khaled talked a little about this. Our sponsors and strategic partners are Healthy City, which is a nonprofit, and the Institute of Health Economics, as well as Alberta Innovates. Kind of the core project team involved Healthy City as a project manager. Data custodian and investigator was myself at the University of Alberta. We had privacy specialists who provided lots of good comments to us over the time from Alberta Innovates. Institute of Health Economics is also providing some project oversight in an advisory position. And then obviously the synthetic data vendor is Replica Analytics as well. And other than that, we also have a couple key stakeholder groups that are really going to be the drivers of whether or not synthetic data can be used more liberally within the province. And that clearly involves the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner, Alberta Health Services that hold all the health data in Alberta, as well as University of Alberta, because we accessed it through a research agreement. Next slide. So our overall aim was really to evaluate the ability of synthetic data to simulate real-world patient-level data out from our administrative health data. And we really focused on kind of the big ones that you see in health outcomes research and health services research around death, emergency department visits, hospitalizations, to see whether or not synthetic data could replicate a typical time-to-event type of study. Next slide.
Thanks, Dean, for starting us off. So I'll be talking about things from the synthetic data perspective. As Cal mentioned, I'm Lucy Muscara. I'm the Director of Data Science at Replica Analytics. So we were responsible for synthetic data creation for this project. So what is synthetic data? Synthetic data is data that looks and feels real. It's data that has the same characteristics and relationships between variables as real data, but has been generated from a model. So the images that you see on this screen, those individuals you see, those are all synthetic individuals that have been synthesized from a model trained on many, many, many pictures of real people. So that's always the fun, flashy example to kind of contextualize what synthetic data means. But for us, we focus on tabular data, which is a little bit less flashy. So similar to the table you see on the bottom right-hand side of this slide. So the general process for synthetic data generation is you have data, you fit a model to the data, then you apply the model and sample from it to generate synthetic observations. So synthetic data is a really powerful emerging privacy-enhancing technology. Generally speaking, use cases are all the things that Dean touched on already, so facilitating data sharing. So some specific use cases that synthetic data could work for would be allowing researchers to gain access to the data more quickly for analytic purposes, which is what we're assessing in this project. But additionally, synthetic data could be helpful for sharing data for training purposes within an organization, or sharing data with external vendors for technology evaluation. But synthetic data can also be used beyond just data sharing purposes. So synthetic data can also be used for data amplification and augmentation. So since each synthetic record is just generated from sampling from a model, it's a very low cost to generate additional observations. So if you have a small data set, maybe from a rare disease trial, and you're interested in applying analytic methods that work better on a bit bigger data sets, you could use synthetic data generation to amplify and augment the data set to facilitate having a easier to analyze data set. Additionally, you could amplify particular subgroups of interest within a data set based on key outcomes or traits. So synthetic data is a really powerful privacy-enhancing technology. And for the purposes of this project, we're just going to be focusing on analytic value of synthetic data for researchers and analysis purposes.
Thanks, Lucy. So I just want to walk you through maybe just a little bit of the data sets to understand how complex some of this data was. Next slide. So in Alberta, we have a number of different administrative health data sets. So we have a demographics and vital statistics data set, which has your age, sex, birth date, mortality dates, etc. We have a drug data set, which includes all drugs that have been dispensed in the province to an individual, regardless of coverage status. So you can imagine that data set is hundreds of millions of records large. We have all the physician visits, all the hospital admissions, all the labs that are completed as an outpatient within the province, as well as all the emergency department visits that happen. So within these data sets, there are literally hundreds of thousands of pieces of data within there in different levels. And we don't use those all within health services research. So we wanted to distill these down into a more manageable group of variables that would be more typical of a health services type of research question that would be done. And as a result, you can see out of the various data sets there, we broke it down to around 5 different variables for each data set. And for example, for the physician visits, emergency department visits, or hospitalizations, it was really distilled down to the time that they spent within the hospital or emergency department, their chief underlying reasons of why they came, as well as some information around the cost of that visit, because that's typically used in health services research. Now, even though there are only 6 variable or 6 data sets here with 5 or 6 variables, I think it's important to understand this still represents hundreds of thousands of different levels and codes within these particular data sets. And so with looking at synthetic data, one of the things that is very evident is that synthetic data has been shown to work quite well when you're looking at a single sequence of events within a simple data set moving forward. But now you're looking at 5 different data sets with hundreds of thousands of different pieces of information or events that have to be sequenced. And so the complexity of this data is actually immense. And the heterogeneity of the number of events is quite large within this data set. Some people had a single event. Other people had 5,000 events that had to be sequenced in the proper order in order to try to simulate that real world data. And so I just wanted to say that, this was a very complex data set, and my hypothesis as a researcher going in was that synthetic data wouldn't work, just simply because I thought the administrative health data sets are simply too complex. Next slide. So what we did out of this data set is we just took a random subset around 80,000 individuals who received dispensations for 2 different opioids within the province. We did this because we have done a similar study using the real world data, and we knew what the results would be. And so we wanted to see if the synthetic data could replicate that. We did a typical time to event type of analysis that is done in health services research, looking at the primary outcome of a composite of time to all-cause emergency department visit, hospitalization, or death after you received your opioid dispensation. And then we also looked at a very specific endpoint. As we know, rare events within synthetic data can be a challenge to model. These are models, and when you have limited data, it can be difficult to build those types of models. And so we looked at a very specific admission to hospital for pneumonia as a prototypical example of a cause-specific endpoint that may not be in high occurrence within the data. Next slide.
Thanks, Dean. So high level, let's take a look at how this complex data was synthesized. So Dean did a really good job highlighting the challenges of working with this complex data set. So just to reiterate, we've got 5 sequences of completely different types of information, all interwoven together for a single individual. We've got high variation in the number of events per individual. We've got heterogeneity in the different variable types, and we have variation in the number and types of attributes for each event type. So at the beginning of this project, we did a big literature review. We looked at published methods and competitors, and we really found that there was no known state-of-the-art methods that would be able to create a synthetic version of data this complex. So we built our own in consultation with a consultant from Mila in Montreal. So high level, our deep learning model works to synthesize this longitudinal electronic health record data by iteratively predicting the next event for each individual based off of the previous events and the baseline characteristics. So the baseline characteristics are things like an individual's age or gender or overall health score as summarized with the Alex House or comorbidity index. So when we train our deep learning model, we feed in the baseline characteristics and a set of events for that individual, and then our model tries to predict what the next event will be for that individual. And we iterate this over all individuals and all events within a sequence. And each time we iterate, we improve the model so that we get better and better and better predictions. And we continue training in this fashion until we find that the predictions from our model have gotten to be as good as they can on a set of observations from holdout individuals that we haven't been optimizing on directly. And so setting up the training in this way is really beneficial because it prevents us from overfitting and reproducing the real data exactly. We don't want it to be a copy and paste of the original data set. There should be some variability. So once we've trained our model, we're able to generate synthetic observations using the same process. So we start off with some synthetic baseline characteristics and first observations for each individual that have been generated using sequential decision trees. And then we ask our model to predict what's going to happen next to this individual. And we go through and we keep iteratively feeding it back and saying, okay, based on everything you've predicted so far, what's next? What's next? What's next? And so we iteratively build up this sequence of events for a single individual until we reach either a death event or a censoring event. And so this is the deep learning model that we've been able to implement in this project. If you want to see the more details about how we've implemented, you might need to wait until our paper is published, although I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of this session. So how good was the synthetic data generated? I'll be showing you guys some generic utility results based off of just comparing the overall characteristics of the real and synthetic data sets, while Dean will be showing how good the synthetic data performed on the specific analysis he's conducted on both the real and the synthetic data. So in terms of generic utility results, these are a whole bunch of figures summarizing what we've found. So for each of the figures where there's a pair, the real data is on the left-hand side and the synthetic data is on the right-hand side. So starting at the top right-hand side, we've just got a comparison of the different events seen in the real data versus the synthetic data. So in both, the distribution looks quite similar. We can see that laboratory tests and emergency room visits were the most common events. So we've been able to reproduce the pattern of the event distributions quite well. Moving along to the bottom right-hand side, it's a comparison of the number of observations per individual. So you can see it's kind of a long-tail distribution where most people have relatively few observations, but there are some who have hundreds of observations per individual. And again, we can see that the distribution is quite similar between real and synthetic. Next, in the bottom left, we've got Hellinger distance values. So this is just a numeric summary of how similar the distribution of each event attribute is between the real data and the synthetic. And so for this numeric summary, a value of 0 indicates that the distributions are exactly the same, and a value of 1 indicates that they're not at all the same. And so we can see that the mean value is approximately 0.027, which is quite small. And the largest Hellinger distance value we have is about 0.08. So overall, all the event attributes have been reproduced in the synthetic data in a way that they have very similar distributions. Last, top left-hand side figure, the colorful one, this is a comparison of the transition matrices between the real and the synthetic data. So a transition matrix looks at if I'm currently having, for example, a hospitalization event, what's the probability that my next observation is a laboratory test or a mortality event? And so the colors denote these transition probabilities, and we can see the same pattern in transitions between the real and synthetic data. So overall, if you look at the real versus the synthetic data, not having any analysis set in mind, you can see that the real and the synthetic data sets are quite similar.
So as Lucy mentioned, my job was to see whether or not it actually gives us the same answer as we might receive within the real world data. And so the slide's a little busy, but in a nutshell, we did a typical time to event analysis using Cox regression models to look at the time to those outcomes that we talked about for either the first opioid or whether or not a person received the second opioid. And what we did is we statistically compared some of the estimates that we derived from the real data compared to the estimates that we received out of synthetic data. And again, it's important to iterate that, this is actually very complex because you've got to get the right event in the right order, in the right time within the synthetic data in order to actually replicate what is happening in the real world data. At the end of the day, if the synthetic data is not able to accurately predict the outcomes as it would in the real world data, it's not a very useful model. And so, there is a lot of complexity to this, and I don't want to go into a lot of details. As Lucy said, it'll be in the paper, we can answer it. But we did do some just very high-level multivariate modeling that included adjustments for age and sex, comorbidity scores, as well as some other antidepressant medications, laboratory values, and a few other things in the model. Next slide. So on some of the key characteristics, I'll just kind of run through this with you. The very first column is the real data, and then on the right-hand side is the synthetic data. So you can see that the average age is around 43, 44 in both data sets, a similar percentage of males. The Elixhauser score is a measure of the number of chronic conditions that an individual has. And so you can see it's very similar with around one chronic condition, which is not surprising considering all patients are receiving opioids. And then the next ones are ALT, GFR, and hematocrit, which are all lab values for liver, kidney, or blood. We looked at some of the kind of the prototypical ones that are measured within many patients within the province. As you can see, they're very similar between the real and the synthetic data. The last two are some of the drugs that we looked at. Obviously, our opioid group is our group of interest, so very similar between them, as well as antidepressant use, which is very common in people with chronic pain. Depression is a very common comorbidity, and so we looked at the use between the real and synthetic data. And again, very similar, around 37, 39%. So overall, there are some very nuanced differences, but clinically, really not much difference between the real and the synthetic data. Next slide. So what did the results show? So what you're seeing are the different outcomes. So on the very top in the gray is the composite outcome, followed by the emergency department visits outcome, hospitalizations, death, and pneumonia. And within each of those boxes, the very top whisker that looks like a TIE fighter from the Star Wars movies, that is actually the estimate for the comparison of the first opioid compared to the second opioid. And then within that, there's two of those. So the top is the real data estimate, and then right below it is a synthetic data estimate. And so you can see that for the composite outcome, emergency department visits, and hospitalizations, the estimate as well as the 95% confidence intervals around those estimates for both the real and the synthetic data are almost identical. And so unlike my initial hypothesis, the synthetic data was actually able to replicate the real world events and the time to those events quite accurately, in fact. On the bottom two boxes are some of our events that are a little more rare within the data. So we have death as well as pneumonia-specific hospitalization. As you can see, the estimates started to get a little bit wider for the synthetic data and the real data because of those low event rate numbers. But overall, again, the synthetic data did a fairly good job of replicating those more rare events within the data. Next slide. And when we talk about the rare events, they were quite rare compared to some of the other endpoints within the data. So when we look around hospitalizations, it was around 30% of individuals had at least one hospitalization. 85% had visited the emergency room department at least once. And then the composite of death, hospitalization, or emergency room visit happened around 86% of individuals. So there was a lot of events for those particular endpoints to use and model around. When we're talking death, we're only looking around 4% in the real data. And as I mentioned, synthetic data does have difficulties with rare events because it is a model and you need events to try to predict and make an accurate model. And so in the synthetic data, it was around 2% is what it predicted for mortality. In terms of hospitalization-specific pneumonia at the very bottom, around 2% of individuals actually had an event for pneumonia which required a hospitalization, and that was actually replicated quite well in both the real and the synthetic data. So overall, the model seemed to be actually fairly accurate with respect to both very common events as well as some of those more rare events within administrative health data. Next slide.
Thanks, Dean. So that's kind of the summary of the synthetic data project from a utility perspective. So it's always good to check in with our other main priority, which is the privacy perspective. So what are the privacy risks? So within the context of this specific project, we had a privacy consultant from Alberta Innovates who worked with us on this project and set up the way that we had data flow between different parties to ensure that we were doing everything appropriately and mitigating privacy risks. So from a procedural perspective, this whole work was facilitated by HIA's research provisions for access to data. So our researcher, Dean, was able to get access to Alberta Health Services data through a research approval and REB approval, and that facilitated access to a version of the data set that had the direct identifiers removed. Then another agreement was put in place between the researcher and Replica Analytics, the synthetic data provider, to provide contractual control for access to the data. Then the real data was kept on a secure University of Alberta server for the duration of the project, where Replica Analytics only accessed the data through VPN. So with this setup for running this project, we believe that the privacy risks have been mitigated for access to the real data. But in terms of the synthetic data itself, what are the privacy risks of synthetic data? So we're just touching on in this presentation, but we have a specific privacy assurance test that is able to assess the risk of re-identification for working with synthetic data. And our test found that the synthetic data set created had a very low risk of re-identification. And so this isn't too surprising because with synthetic data, there's not really any one-to-one mapping. Like I can't tell you, synthetic observation number 10 directly corresponds to real individual number 10. There's no one-to-one mapping because each synthetic observation has been derived from sampling from the model, where the model has been informed by all real individuals. Additionally, the dataset that we worked with for this project already had direct identifiers removed, and there were only a few baseline characteristics, so the privacy risks were very low from the beginning. So just to solidify the information flow throughout this project in a bit more visual way, so Alberta Health Services has the original data, They were then able to produce a non-identifying version of the data set, which the researcher at the University of Alberta, Dean, was able to get access to through REB approval and a research agreement. That real data was then shared with the synthetic data provider, Replica Analytics, through an additional research agreement, as well as remote access using a VPN. So the real data never left the secure environment at University of Alberta, but we were still able to perform the data synthesis in this fashion. So overall, the risks, the privacy risks for this project have been, we believe, sufficiently mitigated through contractual control as well as access control through the VPN. And synthetic data in general has much lower privacy risks, as we were able to quantify with the privacy assurance. So that concludes the body of the presentation for summarizing the Alberta research project for electronic health record data. At this point, I'd really like to acknowledge all our collaborators that have allowed this work to come together. This has been a large project with many stakeholders folding over many months. So Alberta Health Services, Government of Alberta, the School of Public Health at University of Alberta, Alberta Diabetes Institute, and MELA have been really critical for this project to come together.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We do have a few questions that have come in from the audience. So I'll just read them out, and then if you can respond to those. So let me pick an easy one first. Well, maybe not easy. Is ethical review or IRB review needed for this type of research?
Yes, because of the way the data access works within the province of Alberta, which is similar to any province, only researchers have relatively easy access to it. And with that, we have to do ethics to make sure that the data is de-identified, anonymous, and can't be identifiable back to any individual. So we go through the ethics boards.
Okay, a follow-up question. Were there any issues getting REB approval? Any challenges getting REB approval for this project? No,
we have a very robust ethics approval across the province in Alberta. So by the time we put in our project, we generally have approval within 3 or 4 days for these types of projects.
And just on the same theme, who needed to actually give permission to do this?
Yeah, so the permission comes obviously from the stakeholders of the data. So we put in a proposal to Alberta Health Services, who look at the proposal and sign off on the release of the data to me as a researcher. Obviously, I have to have ethics approval as well. And then within that, we had to get additional approvals to share that data with Khaled and his team to help facilitate those analyses. So there was a lot of agreements on the back end, but it was around privacy and mitigating risk of the data.
Okay, thank you. And then we'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll move on to the panel afterwards. So this one is for Lucy. What is the motivation behind using a baseline when fitting the deep learning model?
I think that's just a way of trying to use all the available information and make sure that the result makes sense. With electronic health record data, there definitely are prominent trends in terms of demographic information. So based on an individual's age or sex or region that they come from, you may see completely different trends in the longitudinal portions of the data. So using the baseline characteristics to help inform the longitudinal data generation should help create more coherent synthetic individuals that are able to reproduce those same trends and patterns.
Great, thank you. And then last question. I assume you could not learn anything from the synthetic data that you cannot derive from the real data. So how would you apply this knowledge? Would you take the model and generate synthetic data in a new setting with similar inputs, for example, future or different setting, essentially using the model for prediction or prognostic purposes? I mean, you mentioned the privacy use case, but a prognostic model use case, I think, is what the question is asking about.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons why you may not be able to use the real data. One is that it's unlikely you have access unless you're a researcher in Alberta. So again, generating that synthetic data to share with companies, other researchers in other provinces, outside the country to answer research questions or policy or health delivery questions is where I think the synthetic data really provides that benefit because we can make that data portable, whereas the current data sets stay within the University of Alberta on my servers and no one has access to it. So I think that's one of the key things. But the second one is that, there is an immense amount of data within Alberta as well as other areas of the world. And there's not enough people to look at the data because of all the privacy and regulations. And so I think allowing these data sets to be open for business, so to speak, I think you can advance science and health and all those other things a lot more quickly because you'll be able to have more people interested in questions within the data and answer those questions. So it doesn't have to be, a research question. It could be any wide range of questions that I think could be very beneficial for society as a whole.
All right, excellent. Thank you. I think we'll close it off here. There's still questions coming in. So Dean and Lucy, if you don't mind answering the questions in the Q&A by typing responses as they come in, just to some really interesting questions. We don't have time, unfortunately. So we'll close it off here. Thank you so much. And then we'll move on to the next the next session, which will be moderated by Reg Joseph from Health City. So I'll let Reg take over and introduce his panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khaled. Real pleasure to be here this morning. I am very excited about the opportunity around synthetic data, and really, when we start to look at its use in industry, that's when it really becomes real. And so I have an esteemed panel that's for you today, and I'll introduce all three of them. Given time, I'm not going to go through their bios, and then we'll get started right away. So three panel members: Virginie Giroux. She's the Director of Patient Access and HEOR at Merck. We are also joined by Stephen Bamford. He's the Head of Clinical Standards and Transparency at the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson. And Janice Branson, Global Head of Advanced Methodology and Data Science, Novartis. And we thank you all for being here today. And what we're going to do is we're going to kick it off with a quick introduction to the companies and some of the work that they're doing in the area of synthetic data. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A after that. So Virginie, would you like to kick us off, please?
I definitely can. Let me share my screen for 1 second. All right. So thank you, Reg. So as Reg mentioned, I am the Director of Patient Access at Merck Canada. And what that means more precisely is I am responsible for health technology assessment, health economics outcomes research, and real world evidence. And before I get started, just a quick disclaimer that the opinions I'm expressing today are my own and do not represent the opinions of my employer. So I'm here, as you can guess by my title, to talk about what could we do with synthetic data when it comes to patient access. So before I talk about this, I think I need to level set a little bit with regards to, well, what needs to happen to get access to formularies in Canada. So I'm not going to give you a crash course on Patient Access 101. You can always chat with me after that if you want to. I'm always happy to do it. But I think high level, I want to point out a few important things that you need to be aware of. The first one is that although Canada is one big country, really, it's made up of a lot of little countries. And what I mean by that is that we have a lot of jurisdictions and stakeholders who all want to see data in a certain way and economic analyses in a way that represents their reality. And the type of analyses in particular that HE and payers are interested in are twofold. The first one is pharmacoeconomic analyses. This is value for money. We have two HT agencies in Canada. So CADIS, who does the Canadian perspective, and INES, who looks at Quebec. So obviously, they want models that represent their realities. And then we have budget impact analyses, which really try to estimate what would it cost for a payer to cover the new technology. And again, this has to be tailored to their drug plan, whether it's the province or the private insurer. So a lot of customization has to happen there. And obviously, a lot of inputs are required in those economic models to adapt this to the Canadian reality as much as possible. And you can think of, the rapid evolution of science in the last years, think of cell and gene technology, think of personalized medicine. The level of complexity associated with the economic models needed to support submission for these types of technologies has also increased. So we need very specialized inputs that require patient-level data to generate the assumptions behind them. Thinking a few examples like transition probabilities that Lucy mentioned, we need those in our models. How long do you stay on treatment? How long does it take before you have to escalate your treatment? What do you switch to? What happens to you after? What do you use in the healthcare system? These are all things that, to get a real sense of what's happening, we need to be able to get down to the patient and follow them over time. Now, as Dean pointed out, manufacturers don't have access to that data. And it's not just in Alberta, it's pretty much across the board. There are instances where you can find the right partner and maybe run a study, but those studies take a long time. By the time you have the data available, it might not be relevant anymore. You can have access to aggregated utilization data, which is needed and helpful, but not to do everything that we need to do. So we're left with really just a few options. The first one is straight up assumption. Well, that's not good. It's super uncertain, 100% uncertain, and people don't like that. And so we don't use that. We could make assumptions that are based on anecdotal evidence, if you will. Maybe we did a chart review, maybe we did a survey. We have some insights. A bit better than guesswork, but still highly uncertain. So, and maybe not representative of the whole country. So not ideal again. Sometimes we just have to use evidence from other jurisdictions, the US, the UK, maybe France, depending on how closely our systems seem to align. Again, not ideal. So really, with what we have access to, what we end up doing is making assumptions that render the model suboptimal when you think about it from the decision-making perspective, because it doesn't really reflect the reality in Canada or in the province. And so obviously, the main concern, as I think Dean and Lucy mentioned, with regards to manufacturers or other companies having access to patient-level data, even anonymized, is privacy concerns. Now, I have to say, as a private citizen, I'm very happy that those concerns are there, right? It means that my privacy, my family's privacy is protected, and same for yours. So this is a good thing. But I can't help but to put my hat of, okay, I work for a pharmaceutical company, and my job is to make sure that our great innovations and everyone's great innovations are made accessible to patients who need them. Well, I can help but to think, okay, there's got to be a way to enable or to let people like me do analyses, produce economic models that are more meaningful and that really, really help our decision makers so that they can understand their reality and make the best decision for their jurisdiction. So really, that's why I'm excited about synthetic data, because I think there's a lot of potential there. We could have access to data, generate a lot of analyses, and populate the models with inputs that are relevant. Now, we're not quite there yet, so I'm talking more about the future here, because I think what Dean and Lucy did is fantastic. It's a fantastic first step, but I think we're going to need to do more of those kind of demonstration projects so that our payers, our HTA, become more familiar with synthetic data, are more comfortable with perhaps the uncertainty that's around it. And I think everyone, including manufacturers, we need to be a bit more comfortable and aware of, okay, what can be done with this type of data, but also what shouldn't be done with this type of data. So I think we need more of those projects. And, I think it's amazing that this work is happening, and very excited to be taking part of this work in Canada. So that's the one thing I'm most excited about when it comes to synthetic data and patient access. But there's something else that needs to happen for this to be really routinely used in Canada, is we need to set up the system in a way that enables those data sets to be synthesized so that we can have access to them, so that it can be done rapidly and easily accessed. So maybe that's a subject for the panel discussion, but I think we need to think about how to set it up. And then there's a few other opportunities from a market access standpoint, I think, that I just wanted to highlight. it's always very interesting and important for manufacturers to understand what we call the patient journey. So what does a patient have to go through from diagnostic to treatment to even after treatment? Where do they go in the healthcare system? What happens to them? So that we can better identify the pain points, our best place in therapy. So I think there's a huge potential for synthetic data there as well. And even ultimately, if we can get this going and this becomes more of a thing, perhaps we can use synthetic data to maybe monitor how things, new technologies, new drugs are being used, and maybe generate some hypotheses for potential future down the road. So I'm going to stop here, but I hope I conveyed that I think there's a bright future for synthetic data when it comes to market access, and I think this is a start of something very exciting in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginie. What I was going to do is have everybody present and then ask a bunch of questions, but I'm seeing questions popping up here. So maybe I'll do one question to you, Virginie, before we move on to the next presenter. And that is, how do regulators view the use of synthetic data to generate HTA? Do they use it? Do they see it as equivalent to real world data?
Yeah, so that's the part that we need to get to, right? I think the work that Dean is doing, and that hopefully more and more of those projects we can facilitate and move forward. We need to convince them that indeed it is the same thing. So regulators, is in my books, is Health Canada. I think that's a different story. For me, when it comes to HTA, I don't think they're there yet. So we need to do the work with them. We need to bring them in. We need to have more of those test cases where you can replicate results used using a real data set with the synthetic data set and prove that this is indeed something that works. So it's the future. It's we're not there, but we'll get there.
Thank you very much, Virginie. Let's move on to our next presenter, Stephen Bamford from Janssen.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Reg, and thank you, Khaled, for inviting me here today. So, usual sort of slide, the opinions I'm going to present in the next 10 minutes are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views and policies of either J&J or Janssen Pharmaceutical. So today I'm just going to break down a couple of minutes on each topic. I'm going to give a very, very extremely brief overview on privacy enhancing technologies and let you know where synthetic data sits within there, within Janssen, and then I'm going to delve down more into how we use it and the journey we've been on, and then just a couple of thoughts around where I think we could go from here. And no surprisingly, it follows on from the two presentations that you just heard, really about getting more regulatory guidance and buy-in. But enough of the punchline. Let's take you through the story. So starting off with the privacy enhancing technologies. Well, we have the original data in pharmaceutical companies. For those of you who might not know this, we internally call it the key coded data. So it's essentially already HIPAA type data, and it already doesn't have names and date of births and addresses and social security numbers. So it's basically coded to a subject identifier already. And then we do three things with that. We have two levels of de-identification. We have the risk-based de-identification, which is essentially the regulatory gold standard. This is what's used in Health Canada's PRCI or EMA's Policy 70, and for our external data sharing. We then also have what we term GDPR synonymization, or you could call it a light touch synonymization. And this allows us to have a higher level of data utility because the controls around the sharing of that data are higher. And essentially it's like a balancing act, but that's for another day. The other issue, or the other, not issue, but the other solution really that we've been working on now for 18 months is clinical data synthesis, where, as you've heard from Lucy earlier on, we build a synthetic model and then we use that to generate artificial data. Very, very briefly, just saying the same again in columns, and not only the presentation will be shared, but you'll be able to access this later. But the GDPR synonymization, this is where we use it for internal purposes only. The risk-based identification, this is where we share it for external research purposes. And the key thing that the data synthesis brings us internally is that it's not considered personal information because it's not actually linked to any individual, as you've heard. So we have 3 different tools in our privacy enhancing toolbox, and they all have different purposes. So how do we actually use it within Janssen, and what's the journey we've been on? Well, it's been 18 months. So within the 18 months, so essentially broken down roughly, the first half of last year, as well as COVID taking over, we evaluated synthetic data, and we used that time to get feedback from internal teams about the value of the data, and we started bringing them on the journey. The second half of last year, that was where we went really through the internal socialization. Different teams were starting to use synthetic data, and they reported back to us on their strengths and the weeknesses that they were finding. And then this feedback went back into an iterative process to further enhance the specifications of the synthesis. That brings us to this year, and I guess this year it's production and scaling, and we've been defining service level agreements, and we've been ramping up. And as you can see from the title of the slide, basically we've done 33 clinical studies already. So no mean feat, and just by the fact that we're up to over 30 clinical studies, you can see that there's been an element of buy-in from our clinical colleagues and our data scientists within Janssen. So there are differences between synthesis and anonymization. I won't go into all these now, but I guess some of the more important ones really for us trying to move through within pharmaceutical companies. Basically, we find that because it's more automated, things can be done a lot quicker. So speed is something that basically comes out. But when we actually go and present this to agencies and to organizations around the world, basically the top one is probably absolutely key, really. The fact that that there's less disclosure risk because there's it's essentially artificial data that follows the pattern. Fewer controls are needed to enable us to share data. That makes things quicker. It's less burdensome, and decisions can be made quicker. And we're seeing benefits of that already internally. There are lots of reasons why you can use synthetic data, and I'm not going to stand here now and tell you that we do all of these, but what I can do is I can tell you that some of these have basically come through already. So let's start at the bottom. Education and training. Whenever we use education or training data sets now internally, we're actually using synthetic data. Patients come into clinical trials, they don't give their explicit consent for you to train people using their data. We don't need to now. We have synthetic data that enables us to do that. Data explanation is picking up. Our data scientists are now seeing the benefits of using synthetic data, especially with generating more data than was in the original trial and following patterns. That's basically been very successful recently. Software testing, much akin to the education and training. Whenever we are moving to new versions of software, we basically now use synthetic data. It also enables us to generate a lot larger data sets to allow us to stress test the systems a lot more. And then finally, one that has started really in the last quarter, really, rather than the traditional request for proposal when we go out to work, we've actually moved now to a process for some of our proposals where we're able to actually generate synthetic data, and under a very basic non-disclosure agreement, we're able to actually share this data to potential vendors who can then actually come in and demo their tools or their systems or their products, rather than the traditional way of it just being a slide-based presentation, and companies having to take a leap of faith based on people's PowerPoint skills. So that's basically been something that has really, really starting to show benefit within the organization. Finally, on this section, we talk to project teams, and people say, well, is the data utility good enough? As you've seen from the data that Lucy presented earlier on, accuracy is very good, and there's more and more evidence all the time that that this is working extremely well, and it's no more risky. In fact, it's probably below the thresholds that we're using with the risk-based de-identification, as noted by Health Canada and the EMA. And there's starting to be a bit of movement from regulators and from agencies and from organizations, but it is very new. And you know, to use the saying that Rome wasn't built every day, but they did put a brick down every day. And I think that's what we're doing at the moment. So finally, last couple of minutes, really, I'm just going to talk about the future of synthetic data. And I guess it's starting to be accepted within Janssen, and we are on a journey. And the more examples that we can show, and the more people are becoming used to using synthetic data, we can definitely see that they're becoming more and more comfortable over time. And then they're noticing that it's actually quicker. There's less friction in the system for them to actually get hold of the data, and that's definitely something that's that the methodology is helping. And then finally, what we're looking for, and the perspectives of the regulators. This is very important for internal adoption as well. And the landscape deemed acceptable normalization, and we're now moving forward into synthetic data. So this is definitely one area where we're seeing movement could happen in the next period of time. More broadly across the industry, all companies work at different speeds, especially when adopting new technologies. But it's fair to say that that almost every life science company is investing in machine learning and artificial intelligence, and using their existing data to drive future innovation. And the more that we can reduce the friction to help that process, the better off we are doing for the whole of the organization. So finally, when I reflect on the progress we've made in a relatively short period of time, I've sort of looked at where synthetic data needs to go from here. And I think what's key really is the need to reduce regulatory uncertainty and make it easier, I guess, for companies to adapt and adopt the increased use of synthetic data. And in a relatively short time frame, we've already accumulated data and expertise, and teams are seeing the benefit. But you know, the technology stacks, it's moving at a very, very fast pace. So it'd be good if the whole industry comes on the journey now, and by industry I mean the regulatory industry as well as the pharmaceutical industry and the software industry. Otherwise, that void and that gap can become too big. So Reg, that's all I was going to say as a starter, if that's okay with you.
Wonderful, Stephen. Thank you so much. I do have a quick question for you that popped up here on chat, if you don't mind. And the question is, have you tried generating molecular synthetic data for drug discovery? If not, would this be too far off?
At the moment, we are focusing on clinical data. And the reason why we're starting on clinical data is because everything is quite standardized, but we're trying to get the clinical data use case sorted first.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's move on to our final panelist, Janice Branson from Novartis, please. We can see your slides, Janice.
Yes, thank you.
And we can hear you as well. We just can't see you.
Hopefully you can see me now too, is that right?
we can. Thank you very much.
Okay, so good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot, Reg and Khalid, for the opportunity to be here. So I'm coming from Novartis, and similar to Stephen's discussion that we've just heard, and I'll try and walk you through why the pharma industry is indeed interested in synthetic data. Like the other speakers, these are my own thoughts and opinions and not necessarily a reflection of the views and policies of Novartis. So I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of data sharing and data access very briefly, and then I will move on to some of the challenges that we have to consider when we reuse data. I'll also highlight a little bit about the data sharing exercises internally and externally that Novartis goes through, and then touch on the role of synthetic data. So here you'll see a timeline, and the top of the line is institutions that are really involved and bodies that are involved in helping to share data. By and large, this is anonymized data. On the bottom of the timeline, you really see the regulatory parties that have brought out different policies. You've heard some of them referred to from Stephen, policy 70 from the EMA and Health Canada, that really has pushed the industry to think about sharing data. Reasons for the evolution of data sharing and reuse of data is really three parts to this. One is the reputation of pharma. The second one is drug development is it's as long as it has been over the past many years, a couple of decades, I would say, and there's ever increasing costs. As well as that,
it's Reg. Yes. Sorry to interrupt. Would you be able to put the presentation into presentation mode? Some of the viewers are having a difficult time seeing it.
Is that better now?
That is better. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and the third one is technology. So we no longer have issues with compute power. We've heard there's a lot more emphasis in industry on machine learning and artificial intelligence for big data. And indeed, there's many other different data modalities that we're working with. So what are the challenges that we have to consider? I think there's four main buckets of these. Ethical considerations, then legal and data privacy considerations. We've heard quite a bit about that already. Business sensitivity and good scientific research. So in terms of the challenges around this, for the ethical considerations, when patients consent for clinical trials, they may not be consenting necessarily for reuse of the data. So this is something that we have to really take into account as clinical trial data is personal sensitive information. Legal and data privacy considerations, there's different data protection laws, and these are also different at global and national levels. Scientific, sound and reproducible research is something that we need to be highly aware of. And business sensitivity, so clearly the data are collected for registration purposes of new medicines, so any reuse of the data needs to take this into account. Some of the solutions that we look into in these different areas for the ethical side, either we can look at the informed consent, we can move to anonymization, or indeed generate synthetic data. I won't go through, but you can see the slides at a later stage. Then moving on, what are we doing in Novartis really to share data? So what we are part of is the clinicalstudydatarequest.com, and there we do share our clinical trial data once researchers submit proposals. Then internally, we have a large project, Data 42, which we are bringing together all our research and development data in order to try to facilitate deeper and further advancement of science by really bringing together all these data. In the past, it was all fragmented in different systems. And again, here, when we bring this all together, we need to look at the different challenges that we face when we bring together large amounts of data, and how do we solve some of these situations. So then moving on to the role of synthetic data, I think it's pretty new area for the pharma industry, and there's certainly ongoing discussions also at the industry level. So I'm part of the statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry. We have a data sharing special interest group, and there we've started some discussions on synthetic data. Also mentioned the increased focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence in pharma, and the fact that companies are now really looking how can they reuse or have secondary use of the data that we've collected, really to better understand disease progression, and even look into subsets of patients and how they would respond to various treatments. And of course, we want to do this, use the data, but balance the risk of re-identification with the data utility. Similarly to what Stephen mentioned, current areas where synthetic data is playing a role. I think the first one that we really focused on in my area is the benchmarking of external vendors, when rather than them just bringing their tools into us, we actually are able to provide them with some synthetic data, and then we actually see and can benchmark what the different tools and models and algorithms are actually doing. Internally, we can use it for software development and testing, and I think the others have all been discussed. What is the role of synthetic data in drug development? And I think there may be many other areas, but two potential areas to consider. The first one is, can we use synthetic data as external control arms in actual randomized control trials? This is certainly something we could consider in rare diseases where there's no standard of care existing, and it's probably unethical to administer placebo, or in a situation where the safety profile of a compound is really well understood. I think, as Virginia highlighted as well, currently the gold standard is actually to use actual external data or real world data, but perhaps there is a role here to really see the experience of using synthetic data. Another area is model-informed drug development and in silico trials. I think we see both in Europe and US interest in this area. So there was a funded initiative in the EU, and their definition is really to use individualized computer simulation in the development of regulatory evaluation of medicinal products, devices or interventions. Back in 2017, when Scott Gottlieb was the FDA commissioner, he set up an innovation initiative, and part of this was looking into in silico clinical trials. And indeed, in 2018, the model-informed drug development was actually launched. So I think the regulatory engagement, where are we with that? There's a summary from Wang et al. In 2019 on the FDA view. The areas of focus have been, to this point in time, dose optimization, evidence of efficacy, using simulation to inform clinical trial design and policy development. And I think the paper mentions that future areas are really mechanistic models, medical images, and real world. FPA and Pharma also published a review by Marshall. This is model-informed drug development, drug discovery and development. And there they acknowledge that the impact is still limited due to really acceptance, but it's going to take cross-functional collaboration for success. I think also it's interesting that ICH, model-informed drug development, there will be a draft guideline, hopefully sent out by the end of this year. And just at this weekend, the UK MHRA delivery plan was released, and that also discusses funding synthetic data research projects later this year and into next year, and launching prototypes. So I think it's really an exciting area. And as we've heard from the other speakers, as we see more and more examples, I think we'll start to see more acceptance of this across industry and across regulators. So that's it from me. Reg, thank you.
That's wonderful, Janice. Thank you. I have a question that popped up from chat, and I think this will be a great way for us to kick off the panel discussion because it's a beefy question. And the question that came up in the chat is, who owns synthetic data? Can synthetic data solve legal challenges around data ownership? Janice, would you want to take a stab at that first?
Who owns synthetic data? I'm interested in what everyone else says, but I guess my view is probably because it's not personal information, I would hazard a guess, but I don't know, I'm not a lawyer or a data privacy expert, but I would hazard a guess that really whoever generates the synthetic data is probably the owner of it. I don't know how much from a legal perspective we have to take into account the data from which real data from which it was generated. So maybe that has to be at least acknowledged, but that would be my guess.
Wonderful. Virginie, give us your thoughts.
I would tend to concur with Janice. I mean, again, not a lawyer, definitely not a lawyer, but I would think, you know, if everything is kind of acknowledged properly, whoever generates it, it almost becomes a product, right? That you can then sell. That's my thought. I don't know.
Wonderful. Anything to add, Stephen?
I come at this a slightly different way, and whether it's anonymization or whether it's synthesis, just because it can make the creation and the sharing of data possible, it doesn't mean that we should be doing it. The owner of the data still has an ethical responsibility because that data was given for a particular reason. In my instance, it's the person who was in a clinical trial. So we always consider the ethical consideration of data sharing alongside the practical of whether or not you can share it.
Wonderful.
So doesn't directly answer the question, but it's definitely something to consider.
No, wonderful. And I'm glad you raised that up because I want to get onto that topic, and a few other folks have asked it as well, is around ethics. And so from your individual perspectives right now, what is the biggest ethical question around synthetic data? And Stephen, you brought up ethics, so if you want to take your first stab at it.
Yeah, I guess the data that we start off with has been given to us, I guess, through clinical trials, and the patients or the subjects sign an informed consent form allowing us to do certain things with that data. And when we step outside of that, we then move into the likes of having to anonymize or synthesize the data to remove any privacy concerns. However, the biggest concern we have at the moment, I guess, when you think about big data and data scientists is trying to ensure that, so the data privacy side of it, we're quite comfortable with, but where we need to concentrate a little bit now is basically on the commercialization of the data. And for example, you know, we're all very clear that we wouldn't give the data to a company that was going to go on and sell it, but what would happen if the company was to then go and use the data for perpetuity in their system to then create a product that they then go on and sell? So that's what we're grappling with at the moment when we think about that.
Well, thanks. Janice, your thoughts on some of the biggest ethical issues around synthetic data?
So I think when it comes to patient data, ethics are at the core of, or they're at the foundation of it all. Whether it's how we use the actual coded data, and that's you know, we have principles in place for that, because for clinical trials we follow good clinical practice, which is based on good ethical principles. So I think when we move into these more uncertain areas and new areas, we need to make sure that we really set out the principles for which we work under and take this into account. And I think this is all being worked out. I don't think we have any industry-wide alignment on that, but I hope that we will get there.
Thank you. And Virginie?
Well, I definitely agree with Janice and Stephen. I would think that this is something that as we try to get this going in Canada and set it up for the type of use that I described in particular, I think this is something that we need to take into consideration. The research projects that Dean is running through goes through ethics. So how do we move that forward then in a type of use in-house, if you will, and consider ethics, in that setting? I think that's part of the discussions and the thinking that needs to happen before we can readily use it in Canada.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to switch gears on you now. We've heard about some wonderful work that all three of you are doing around synthetic data, some of the use cases. I'd like to understand where you see some of the barriers and challenges around synthetic data. So, Virginie.
Well, like I said, for me, this is all starting in terms of how we can use it from an access perspective. So it's understanding what's the sandbox, right? How do we play with this? What gets accepted? Getting it accepted, making sure that what's okay for the right hand is okay for the left hand in terms of regulatory may accept something. Well, will HTA accept it as well? I think these are some of the challenges that are not unsurmountable, because I think it's all about working together and creating it together to overcome them and agree on what it is. But yeah, from my perspective, that would be it, I think.
Janice?
Yeah, I think it's similar. I think it's becoming much more comfortable with synthetic data, seeing a lot of examples, and then really, I guess, becomes more acceptable and also acceptable to regulators. And I think we're not there yet. It's going to be a journey, and we need to choose wisely, I guess, the sort of cases we would use synthetic data first of all, and then really build up on that. I guess if you think about the safety profile of a compound, it's not going to fly that you just use synthetic data. You will need to test for and gain real safety data, but there are probably areas, as we touched on in the presentations, that indeed we can tackle first of all. Yeah.
Wonderful. Any last comments from you, Stephen, on this topic?
Yeah, I guess first of all, a challenge is bringing people on the journey. It's new, and the healthcare industry is quite conservative. Some companies are conservative within a conservative industry, which doesn't help. But I guess the end game of what the data is going to be used for, because the regulators haven't come up with a position, people probably feel a bit nervous about using the data in a clinical setting in case, let's say that they manage to find a signal and that signal is true, and then basically it all hinges on synthetic data was one of the things that was one of the catalysts, and the regulators haven't yet said that they will accept that. Now that's quite a risk, and I guess the biggest challenge really is to try and get the regulatory authorities to come to the table and make a decision.
I've got a couple of questions coming up from chat, and so instead of doing the round robin, I'll point them to one of the individuals, and we'll see if we can have a quick discussion around that. One I found interesting, and might be a good one for you, Virginie. Is synthetic data necessary if real-world data is widely available?
Yes, because it's not widely available. I mean, the data is there, the evidence is not available. Running those real world evidence studies take a long time, and you can't do it on every single input that you need. So like I said, if you want to make a model that is as customized as possible, that really aligns with reality as much as possible, then ideally, in an ideal situation, every input in that model is informed by actual data. That doesn't happen. So when we run those real-world evidence analyses, first of all, they are 2 to 3 years in the making. By the time you get them, they may not be relevant anymore. The market has changed. Some new competitor came in. It's not included. So I think there's a place for both. I think there's a place for real-world evidence research, 100%, but I think there's a place for real-world, for synthetic data to kind of fill the gaps a little bit and enable better dossiers for our decision makers.
Wonderful. Stephen, I've got a question for you around sort of the use of synthetic data, particularly around consent. So if you have consents to use synthetic data in various aspects, can it be used for any purpose? And how does that tie into sort of consents and ethical considerations?
Okay, it comes back to the ethical consideration now. Just because synthetic data removes the privacy concerns and allows us to be more comfortable sharing the data, nothing actually gets shared, but it comes through the group that I run within J&J. It comes through and we track every request where data is reused, and we have a board and or like a panel, and depending on the request, sometimes I have to go to the panel. That includes bioethicists, it can includes lawyers, privacy experts, and basically we review things on a case-by-case basis, and you know, we're trying to do things properly, and again the commercial sensitivity and the bioethics, and that's important to us as a company, and that comes at the front of any decision making.
Janice, a question to you around governments, regulatory bodies. How is this landscape evolving, and are there certain jurisdictions that you see have actually moved the opportunities for synthetic data ahead in different ways and others have not?
So I think the main health authority agencies are certainly interested in this area and willing to look into it, but it's very early days of the journey. I don't know of any that are totally against it or anything like that, but as far as I know, there's an openness to look into it, but where it will lead us, we're on the start of this journey.
Excellent. Okay, now I'm going to do one more last round robin question for each of you, and it's a two-part question. So the first part is, we have heard about some of the cases, use cases that you've been using within your own organization. From your perspective right now today, what is the best use case for synthetic data? Where are you seeing the most value? And then part two is, dream a little bit with us, and where do you think synthetic data could really go in the future? Where do you see the exciting horizons for this data analytic technique? So Janice, we'll get you to start off.
Okay, so for the today, I think the key one for me and where I've seen success is really this benchmarking of vendors. So being able to provide external folks synthetic data so that we really understand what their tools and software are doing. So that's been very beneficial and much more efficient and effective for us. The future and dream of the future, I really think that is if we find the right parts of drug development to be able to actually avail and use synthetic data, where we still are as thorough in our investigation in terms of safety and efficacy of our drugs, but we find the right place to use it. If it can help bring medicines to patients faster, that would be my dream.
Wonderful. Stephen, today and the future.
Without being boring, and unfortunately I got a background on, but if you see my piece of paper here, I've written down the RFP example that I gave and also control alarms. So identical to what Janice said, which is unsurprising given that we're both from large pharmaceutical companies. And
in terms of your future visions, Stephen? Where can this go?
Control alarms, really, being able to run a control alarm study and basically anything that can help get new innovative medicines to patients quicker and safer is good in my book.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. And Virginie, same
I feel
question.
like I'm going to sound like a broken record. I mean, I agree with everything that was said, but for me, it's all about access and getting HTA to understand it. So to me, the best use and the future is the same, is I want HTAs to recognize what regulators may eventually recognize, whether it is trials and control arm, whatever it is. But also I want them to realize that this is a tool that is a fantastic way to overcome some hurdles with customization and tell a better story for Canadian patients to get access to the innovation. So it's one and the same.
Wonderful. Thank you. We do still have a couple of minutes left, and there is a question in the chat, and I'll sort of open it up to whoever would like to answer. It's a bit of a technical question. So how much real data is needed to create synthetic data? In other words, is there minimal necessary required real data to build the synthetic data set? Who'd like to jump in? Stephen.
Yeah, it's about 50 observations per variable that you're going to synthesize. So if you want to synthesize across 5 variables, it's 250 observations, roughly.
Any other comments from either Janice or Virginie on this one?
I have no clue.
Janice, I saw you
no,
muting.
Not for me.
No. Okay. No. Well, look, folks, I want to thank you all very much for participating in today's panel. It's very exciting to hear the work that you're doing, and to ensure that we sort of keep on time, I will pass it back over to Khaled. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Reg, and the panelists for this really interesting discussion. Our next presentation and final one for today is from Karen Cuenco, who's a Senior Program Officer in Integrated Delivery, Global Health at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she leads the Knowledge Integration Initiative, which is focused on helping partners conduct and translate research into recommendations for action. Before joining the foundation, she designed, conducted, and led statistical genetics and epidemiologic computational projects that cut across industry divisions. She had an academic life as well in the past, which encompassed multiple disease domains ranging from infectious to neurologic outcomes, fieldwork, and analytic methodology. She's also an adjunct. She has an adjunct faculty position at the University of Pittsburgh, Department of Human Genetics. And Karen will give us a perspective from a research funder's, or give us research funders' perspective on the role that synthetic data can play, and also discuss some of the projects that the foundation is involved in. So with that, I'll let Karen take over.
Thank you, Khaled. Let me make sure I'm sharing. Hopefully that's sharing now.
Yes,
okay.
Perfect.
All right, great. So thank you, everybody, for providing your perspectives on synthetic data, and it's a great way for me to learn about what's going on. So I also have a similar slide of disclaimers. I am an employee of the Gates Foundation, so I just want to clarify again that everything in my talk and my comments in the session are my opinion, not the foundation's official position. And this is a discussion and presentation of the current state of my journey and my colleagues. And the collaborations that I may mention are not endorsements of these collaborations. It's just sort of sharing what's been learned. The foundation is built upon Bill and Melinda's belief that all lives have equal value. We're a large organization that works on many different causes, but our belief captures why we do what we do. And as many of you know, the foundation's in a unique position, and it uses its guiding principles for choosing the challenges that we take on. We focus on areas of greatest need. So we work to address gaps in health, economic opportunity, and education where we believe we can have the greatest impact. In order to tackle these big challenges, we work with partners who have the expertise and experience in those areas. We also collaborate with governments, the private sector, and other funders to ensure the best possible alignment to fill these critical gaps. We also have a culture of taking risks where others can't or won't. We look for opportunities so we can serve as a catalyst, bringing together both public and private sectors and civil society to address challenges that are standing in the way of a better life for the world's poorest people. We have the ability to apply new thinking to big problems, which sometimes means taking calculated risks on promising ideas. And we accept that risk and failure are part of the process. In order to identify how and where we show up, we need evidence. And so data and inference are integral to how we carry out all of our work. Every day, each of us is making a choice, and we strongly believe in bringing high quality and updated evidence and inference to our conversations and our internal strategy. Why? Because the impact and effectiveness are the key outcomes that we're interested in. I am a member of the Foundation's Quantitative Sciences Group, where there is the Knowledge Integration Initiative that has been going on for a little over 7 years. This KI group facilitates data activities that help with program-specific internal investment strategies. This includes direct assistance to our programs and piloting how to accelerate learning from existing data, improving future collection of data, and how to move data. KI partners with specialists who are from private and public organizations who bring a different lens to the data. We found out very early that convening those different lenses, like many of the other speakers, and trying to convene them together to try new techniques or explore data with domain experts from different institutions can be very difficult. One of the major constraints has been overcoming the hurdles and sharing information, even when our data contributors from different lower middle income countries and high income countries want to collaborate with the experts that we've brought into the room and to be able to look at the information. The graphic that I have on the right-hand side of the screen represents a KI collaborative analysis that was led by a team at the University of California, Berkeley. And they had assembled 18 sets of data from different data contributors who were funded by the Gates Foundation. And these data were used in a series of analyses to understand the role of stunting and wasting in children under 2 years of age. As I said, the data were originally funded by the foundation, and the idea was to reanalyze the data for a different purpose from each individual study's research question. And our hope was that something could be gleaned in addition to what was already learned from the combined data to increase further impact of these individually funded studies. So KI provided the infrastructure to support this ongoing guardianship of these data from our contributors. We have a repository. We enacted data agreements to be in place and our data controllers. And it's actually a very high maintenance task. There's a lot of resources that are required, including time. And that time can slow down researchers getting to the data inference as the teams are delayed in analyzing and collaborating with the domain experts. So why were these data important to the foundation? What we found is that once we're able to get the data agreements into place, and remember, there's 18 different studies, so that's at least 14 of different agreements that had to be put in place for data contribution and then for data access, representing these 18 different studies. Once we were able to put those agreements in place to be able to share the raw data, the combined data were the first to allow access to the longitudinal data to identify age-specific patterns in stunting and wasting. And it was the first analysis to look at the diversity of study, to be able to study time and space of stunting and wasting. And it was the first time that we had a large amount of data that could identify subgroups at highest risk. What we learned from this data changed how we, as practitioners in the foundation, thought about recovery from stunting and wasting in the geographies that we serve. We discovered that the time frame was actually earlier than was believed in the past. And this was important for strategy choices and where we put our investments. It also became clear that the value is not when the data are at rest after the initial study is completed, but in the quick and early reuse of this data. What we've also noticed in K is that over and over again, these fundings, when studies are funded, it's become really tough to overcome concerns about individual subject privacy, which has led to all these data agreements and database permissions. We acknowledge these are incredibly important to maintain, the privacy and access permissions. But as an organization, we're impatient to generate answers with the members of the communities and the geographies that we work with. How do we get data users and data consumers who can change how things are done on the ground? How do we get them faster access to more of the global data collected so that new information can be generated? The current narrowing of access to the original raw data which is the normal practice that we need to consider on how to improve on these practices, it limits the use by a broader community, as many of the speakers have stated. And this is even after the study is completed. I want to mention that the restrictions can lead to data not being reused, as writing proposal applications to data is not always the best investment if there's a high probability of the data not being relevant to the question. Imagine in the case that I showed earlier, having to develop full research protocols to access each of those studies, of which you aren't even sure if any of them will be useful for your study. Is that really the best investment of funds and time? There are attempts at de-risking the raw data through pseudo-anonymization, but not all the data contributors or database controllers that we work with are comfortable with the risk level of releasing this data more freely, even under those conditions. Getting data agreements completed to move data through this filter from the left to right-hand side of this image. For foundation partners, the resources and infrastructure needed to handle data agreements, hosting sensitive data for collaborative analyses, having sustained computing connections to work in protected environments next to the raw data isn't really practical for many of our partners. Thus, we further delay access to learn from the combined data. What is the hope? That we can move together quickly. I contend that the cross-pollination between specialty areas, where analogies can be drawn, increases novel approaches being applied to a subject topic. New users could identify new use cases, furthering research, innovation, and health discoveries. All of these experts working together with an easily accessible view of the data would lower the barriers to accelerated research and innovation to address the outcomes of public importance. What if the decision makers, data users, and data communities had a common starting place to start a conversation? That isn't the current state. If it were possible to confirm privacy viability levels of synthetic data at each of these levels, then one of the major concerns about revealing identity could be alleviated. Privacy protection is a major consideration because we deal with data that is generated from people. Our research and innovation exercises are coupled with our responsibility to protect privacy rights. But if synthetic data can protect those rights and still provide opportunity to perform research to help with making strategic decisions on how to improve daily experiences, then data in the synthetic form can be used to its fullest. And so my question is synthetic data the way to increase the flow of information while protecting individuals? If it is, could we move synthetic data generation directly into the data contributors' hands with little cost? Could we move it to our grantees? Could it be the norm, easy to do, and maintain privacy for multiple types of analysis? Could it be inexpensive as well? So along with our partners inside and outside of the foundation, we are interested in understanding the practicality or limits for broader research and later product development. The answers to these types of questions on the screen will be nuanced, but require accessibility for others further away from hands-on data work to understand the risks. These kinds of questions are what sophisticated data contributors and consumers want to know. How might we enable decision-making in a thoughtful manner? If the answers to these technical questions have promising answers, that changes our perspective of the research environment from a hypothetical, maybe synthetic data generation will work as a technical component with limited usage, to there is solid evidence behind this idea and it can improve how global health research gets done. Those questions are in the early phases of our KI team learning from our partners. The questions on this slide are additional questions around privacy that we need to understand and also how to approach addressing these. The balance between sharing high quality synthetic data and its implementation needs to be assessed. There is concern about different levels of identification, either at the group or individual level. And we hope through future partnerships to evaluate the risks of these issues occurring and understand what infrastructure is needed to balance that risk. In KI, we mainly work on health-related topics. These are the types of data that we have on our radar right now. There's quite a variety of data, and I do realize that many of these types of data are actually quite difficult to simulate. We currently have some partners looking into 3 of these areas, and we're always interested in what others recommend or have learned from their own experiences. The synthetic data learning experience in the foundation is not exclusive to our global health interests. Our K-12 education group is also interested in how to increase learnings from educational systems data. One of their partners, Texas 2036, is a nonprofit working with Texas education providers to think about how to use data. There are many questions about what educational support system needs to be created if kids are to move into the workforce. Is a K-12 education enough as an education plan to move them into the workforce? Or should we be looking at kindergarten through college or 4 years post-college to establish what's needed for a workforce? In the US, the education data is particularly difficult to access by researchers to study these questions because of policies put in place to address privacy concerns. US federal law prohibits release of student grades and individual tracking. The hope is that synthetic data generation may help meet an acceptable level of differential privacy. If it does, then there could be a better understanding of where and how to direct resources to improve workforce stability. We think that some combination of the bottom 4 bullet points on the screen will need to be incorporated into the approach for synthetic data to meet specific stakeholder concerns. The answers to the questions that I posed earlier will be useful in the educational research setting, as similar membership and individual identification concerns exist in US education research. Another impact case for synthetic data from the Foundation is that we think that synthetic data may be helpful in the everyday release of data from publications. Databases maintaining sensitive raw data could be transformed into repositories for data sufficient for reanalysis without the concern for leaking personal information. Moving the synthetic generation into the data contributors' hands could speed the release. The importance of replicating published work using data that resembles the original data, including when multiple studies are combined, or what I refer to as mega-analyses, is also of interest. So that first image that I showed you on stunting and wasting is an example of mega-analysis. If we're interested in the research and development and mechanisms underlying health outcomes, sometimes that outlier data is also of interest to us and helps us understand the mechanisms and to draw analogies. And it can also help with defining new subgroups with unmet need. Replicating these findings would also let us assess what results are reliable and can be used as a basis to initiate further investments on sturdy results. By being able to see synthetic data that is representative of the original raw data, we can assess the blue area in the lower curve. That blue area represents different reasons for retractions in the publication. If we know earlier and we're able to conduct the correct analyses quickly, then there would be little delay in getting appropriate evidence for our strategic investments rather than waiting. The last use case that I'll elaborate on is a hope for synthetic data to allow the release of large quantities of longitudinal data to get novel insights. And it was great to see the other speakers talk about real-world data. This is an area that we're especially interested in, so we can learn a lot more from this. We have partnerships with NIH, who is invested in addressing COVID-19, partially through its N3C efforts. N3C is a collection of real-world data from different academic medical centers. And N3C is interested in synthetic data as an alternative to controlling raw data. For novel inquiry, it may turn out to be cumbersome to do on-demand synthesis versus in mass synthesis. This is something that I'm personally interested in and understanding the limits for research versus privacy maintenance. And so this is one of the areas that we're looking at. And we'd also like to understand, would repeated synthesis, if we do on-demand synthesis, jeopardize risk of identification? Should we even do synthesis in mass? Is it possible or even practical for some of the kinds of data that we're thinking about? So what I've shared is my current thinking, and is of course subject to change depending on the evidence and the conversations that we have moving forward. Through the relationships with grantees and partners, KI pilots these kinds of projects in synthetic data to help us understand what's possible and its limitations. We think that synthetic data may be the route to addressing privacy concerns, and it may enable more data use for high-value impact. This would be a new solution for us that feeds the learning cycle to improve community outcomes in foundation areas of interest. But we must consider how we actually implement this and how it will impact individuals in our communities. So I hope that you have a better idea of my opinion and how I see synthetic data improving everyday lives and some of the activities going on in the foundation, and that it's clear there's room for learning, conversations, and partnerships. And I'll end there.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Let me just start off on Q&A part by following up on a couple of points that you made. You mentioned sharing data from published articles in journals. It's difficult when the burden is on the researchers to create the synthetic data. Do you see publishers creating platforms that, or they already have some platforms or work with some platforms, but do you see them taking on the responsibility of creating the synthetic data and making synthetic data sets available as a more viable path forward? Or do you think it would have to fall on the individual researchers to make this happen?
So I think it's possible for the publishers to put some kind of synthetic generation tool in place to accompany published manuscripts, since there's a requirement for these data to be released for many of the journals. It is a question of, will the publishers want to do it, of course. And then there's also the issue of the publication is only a portion of the data that's typically collected. And so we are often interested in, especially in the research and development side, on data that might not have been published yet, if we can get access to it early. So we often at the foundation hit hurdles where data isn't published yet. Data contributors would like to share that information with us, but they don't have the means or knowledge to synthesize the data. If we could make it easy and affordable for them, whether it be subsidized ability to be able to do that, it would help us a lot for our purposes at the foundation. But I could also see, for release of published results that a publication group, a journal group could actually be hosting that as well.
Okay, thank you. You also touched upon, not touched, you covered the privacy concerns quite a bit as one of the barriers that are potentially solved by synthetic data. Do you have some insights into regulator perspectives globally on whether they would accept synthetic data as a privacy preserving mechanisms to share data from these studies?
So we're exploring what people think of it. There's obviously acceptance of anonymized data. I think there's a road ahead, as many of the speakers have noted, to have those conversations with regulators and to provide education for them too. I think in the official policies of the regulation authorities is that we're not there yet. But as far as the practitioners within the regulation authorities, I think there's curiosity as far as could this help them? There's also the reverse issue of not putting data into the regulators' hands, but regulators sharing data out. So there's adverse event databases. How much of that could be freed up by doing synthetic data generation? So I think the regulators are curious as well. And the more results that we can put in front of them, both good and bad, I think the more acceptance there will be. It's been actually pretty surprising how quickly RWD data was accepted by regulators.
Just switching gears a little bit and talk about other funders. Clearly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is interested in exploring this further. Do you see other funders exploring or being interested in supporting the sharing of synthetic data? Because one of the challenges, even with anonymization, was funders were not willing, maybe until recently, to fund the creation of anonymized data. So there was no incentive for data custodians to do it because they didn't have the funding for it. So that was always a barrier. Do you see, when it comes to synthetic data, a change in approach or a change in attitude among other funders, or interest in exploring this, or not yet, or you don't see it happening? Or
I do see it happening. I think it's new to many of the funders. Private industry moves fastest of anything because of the need to compete and adapt. The funders are learning from the private industry and from the academic units who are sort of developing the methods for generating this kind of data. I know funders are frustrated that data can't move quickly enough, and funders, when collaborating with other funders, you quickly discover that there's a lot of data agreements to do, and it can take a while to move a project along. So I think it's been a learning experience for other funders as well. And so when I've discussed synthetic data as a future state, there's interest, there's curiosity. They're not sure about it, but the possibility of moving things along faster is of interest to the funders.
Okay, thank you. One point you mentioned, maybe if you can just clarify, was on-demand and mass synthesis. Can you just explain a little bit more what the differences are and pros and cons from what you've seen between those two?
So I'm learning on this process. So the on-demand is really focused on if you have a research question in hand and there's a certain set of variables that you're interested, and you request for that subset of variables from the larger study, collected study data to be synthesized. And it's just that subset of data that's synthesized and then shared with the data user. The en masse synthesis is taking the entire data set. So all types of data, laboratory tests, clinical outcomes, anything that's been collected over the course, in this case for the pharma folks for any of the trials, and synthesizing everything without really an idea of what the research question is going to be. And the idea of exploring, is that a practical thing to do, is one to figure out, could we just put an entire data set out in the open with some kind of permissions around it that we're still trying to understand what kind of permissions put on there, but could you put that synthesized en masse in total data set out and then just let people assess, is there something new I can learn from this entire data set versus I'm coming at this data set with a single question, and so I only need a few variables. So that's what we're thinking about.
And no data to support either approach yet.
Well, we know that the partial. Let me make sure I use the right phrasing. The subset of data, if you synthesize that the results look pretty good. Of course, because you have a confined set of variables for synthesizing. For the larger en masse picture, we don't have insights yet. Ironically, we're dealing with data agreements, and so to be able to do an en masse synthetic data assessment, so we're hoping to get those kind of results by the end of the year.
Excellent, thank you. And then there's one last question, and then we'll move to the closing. Is there any possibility that the results from synthesized data are closer to the ground truth than those from the real data? For example, if synthesized data has reduced the noise in the original data, because you build a model, and so you're essentially filtering out the noise in the model. So when you generate synthetic data, you have less noisy data.
It's possible, essentially. I mean, it's looking at synthetic data as a way of cleaning data and finding aberrant variations in the data that just are errors in entry or something like that, and that would be suppressed anyways. It's possible. I don't think we've actually directly asked that question, so it's a good question for us to take a look at.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you making the time today and presenting to us the Foundation's perspectives on this. Yeah, thank you. And I think we'll close off now. We have a few more minutes left. There are no more questions in the queue. With that, I'll also say thank you to Karen and all of our presenters and speakers. I think this was really informative. A lot of information here. We will be, again, sharing the videos and the materials with you in the next couple of days.